In this episode of You Must Be Woking, we're exploring the topic of banter in the workplace and whether or not banter should be banned outright for organizations. We're going to delve into how organizations navigate this topic and whether or not leaders need to be stepping in and doing more to prevent banter in the workplace and what the consequences are of having banter in your workplace. Welcome back to You Must Be Woken, the podcast where we have the honest and sometimes tough conversations on the topic of diversity and inclusion with her, Dawn Hurst.
And him, Craig Richards.
This is a bit of an interesting topic, right? Particularly for some of our clients that we've worked with over the years. This is a really tough topic, but is actually one of the leading causes of employment tribunals in recent years, right? It's been one of the biggest issues within employment tribunals. So hopefully we're going to delve into whether banter is a good thing or a bad thing for the workplace. And as leaders and organizations, how do you navigate the tribulations of banter in the workplace? But before we do that, how you been?
Been all right.
Too.
Yeah, been doing some good stuff this week. Loads of data mining and manipulation, looking at some SMEs and those that are led by people who are either disabled or from a perceived ethnic minority or female-led, and what that actually means and what support they've got to succeed. So that's been really interesting.
That is right fascinating.
Yeah, it has.
Good.
And personally been doing loads of walking again on this fitness plan. So trying to keep up with that.
Doing well. You've lost a load of weight. You're looking fabulous as ever.
Thank you.
I'm a charmer, I know. Yeah, I've been busy. Like, work's been crazy the last few weeks. So I'm not going to dwell on that too much because it's just keeping me busy. But personally, I am currently preparing for Jacob's grandparents to come and stay at the house. So I'm writing kind of guides on how to use the oven, how to use this, and how to navigate
operating manual.
What time does Jacob need to be up in the morning and out for school and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, they're coming to stay while I'm going away for a few days. So that'd be nice to see them. It'll be lovely for him because he doesn't get to see them as much as he would like. So really good for him, really good for them. A little bit stressful for me.
No, it'll be fabulous.
It'll be good. It'll be all good. It'll be all good. And obviously they've got to look after Ruby as well now. So it's not just Jacob they're looking after. They've got to look after baby Pup.
Ruby.
Yeah. She's doing really well. She had no accidents in the house today. I was very, very happy about that. Did all her wheeze and poos outside. So good girl, Ruby.
Well done,
Ruby.
Very
happy. All right. Should we get into it? Should we talk about banter? It's an interesting topic, isn't it? So you may have seen, listeners, in the headlines in recent weeks and months, banter is becoming a bit of a hot topic for organizations to kind of navigate their way around this stuff. But a recent decision by the Watford Employment Tribunal in a case, Richardson versus West Midlands Trains, saw a train driver reinstated and awarded £40,000 in compensation after he was found to have been unfairly and unlawfully dismissed for performing pranks on a colleague. So I'm going to read you a bit more of the detail because it's quite important in this one. The case involved two pranks made on the same colleague. Following a conversation where the colleague indicated a squeamishness about insects and spiders, the claimant placed a tarantula's shed exoskeleton in her pigeonhole at work. The claimant had hoped to elicit a reaction of momentary shock, followed by relief once the colleague realised it was merely just a shed skin and not a live tarantula. The colleague was distressed and required another colleague to remove the exoskeleton. The tribunal found that the claimant had been told by the colleague not to repeat his actions, but that he considered this conversation to be banter, so he didn't take it seriously or appreciate the level of the colleague's upset. The second prank followed and, as hinted, involved placing a snake skin in the colleague's pigeonhole. The colleague was distressed and reported it to a line manager, resulting in subsequent dismissal of the claimant for gross misconduct. It's a really backwards way of looking at banter, right?
Yeah,
it's an opposite way, and the courts took a slightly different view. Where do we want to start with this one? How do we unpack this for our listeners?
Well, should we start by defining banter? Because banter is supposedly light-hearted, gentle teasing, whatever that means, and something that won't cause a negative impact to the recipient and isn't personal. So there's a few, I can see where they went to the gross misconduct on that. And I would have loved to read the court papers in terms of the mitigating, because that would be really interesting. But yeah, the reality is we shouldn't vilify banter, because actually we all work much better in an environment where we're relaxed and we can, in the boundaries of banter, build relationships with our colleagues. So in that particular case, it's an interesting one.
Yeah, so I thought the case was fascinating, primarily because, this interpretation of what banter is and the individual, and then him being fired for doing these kind of things. So it's a kind of a different way of looking at banter in a non-traditional sense, I guess. For me, though, I guess I have a bit of a challenge. Not a bit challenge, because I don't want to ban banter in the workplace, just to be clear. But I do understand why some organizations are getting to the place where they're saying, do you know what, we'll just ban banter, right? So I understand why that's happening. And I guess part of that leans into inclusive culture. So if the foundations of an inclusive culture are to create a safe, pleasant environment for people to be able to be their best selves at work, and banter is making them scared and upset, like in this case, then surely that's counterproductive to creating an inclusive culture. So I guess I am understanding, or trying to be understanding, as to why organizations are leaning towards banning banter, because it's contradicting this drive that they're trying to have to be more inclusive as an organization, right?
So where do we end up? We ban banter, we ban swearing, we sanitize our businesses, we push these things underground, and we create cliques where we're comfortable. There's a massive consequence to us handling this topic.
And I genuinely think you hit the nail on the head there for me, because you push this underground, right? That was the phrase that you said then that kind of resonated for me, because that's exactly what happens, right? People will then just go, oh, for goodness sake. So they'll have inside jokes, right? And it'll be about their cliques and their kind of, you're in our gang, and therefore we can have these inside jokes. But, it's much harder for personnel officers, HR officers to be able to kind of monitor what's going on and whether that's impacting our culture, because it's gone underground. And I think that's the biggest risk here. There's another one that I thought I'd share with you as well. And it's a bit dated now. So it's about 4 years ago, but Personnel Today ran an article in 2020 saying that football banter in the workplace should be moderated, as it can encourage laddish behavior and exclude women. What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's part of a wider topic, isn't it? The reality is, I don't think we should ban any topic other than the obvious in the workplace. If we suddenly...
Sorry, what was the obvious?
So religion, politics,
racism,
those kinds of topics that might be in really contravention of our standard operating procedures. But, people get a lot of pleasure from sports. Now, the bigger challenge is that they're encouraging everybody into the conversation, and you don't need to be a football expert to be involved in a conversation. It can be a wider discussion. And the key thing is, if you've got a couple of your colleagues sitting completely mute during that conversation, that's the responsibility of everybody else to bring them in. It's not necessarily the topic.
Yeah, so you can literally just say, oh, Dawn, do you not like football? You're not getting involved in the conversation. What are you into, Dawn? What's your kind of hobbies? And then suddenly it becomes a slightly different environment. Okay, yeah, so I understand that. I have to say, I'm a big football fan. So the thought of banning football conversations just makes me really uncomfortable. But equally, I do recognize that sometimes I can wax lyrical about football, because I'm passionate about it and other people might not be.
And let's play that out. So suddenly we ban football conversations. So what do you all do? You go and make a coffee at the same time and you have the football conversation, and you've now left your colleagues actually sat on their own because you can't have that conversation, which is worse.
So I guess that for me, though, so I agree with what you're saying, by the way. I don't disagree with anything you've just said. But I guess for me, I have sympathy with the line managers in this scenario, because how do you then police banter in that way, right? How does it go from, it's a football conversation, but Betty's not upset because we're talking about football? Like, that's quite hard to navigate as a line manager, right?
It is. And I think this, again, is where we've got to apply a bit of common sense. The moment we step into unlawful behaviour, which in the majority of countries is anything that's personal against a characteristic, we've crossed the line, and a line manager should take a much stronger stance in that. When we're talking about, a fairly inanimate topic, the reality is that so long as we're not physically excluding anybody and it's not taking up 70% of the working time, the line manager's just got to be mindful of making sure everybody is being included. And if Betty wants to bestow the virtues of her netball club at the weekend, absolutely everybody should take part in that discussion too.
So you mentioned something in there that piqued my interest, this crossing the line, this kind of, going into unlawful. Like, how I'm Craig, line manager of a team of 10 or whatever, right? How on earth do I know? Like, what's this line? Where does this line come from?
So the line's this beautiful imaginary grey line that can mean 10 different things to 10 different people, because none of us know where each other's line is. So you and I, who have known each other for a long time, could probably stretch that line before we make each other, in the definition, feel uncomfortable or upset or intimidated or any of those good things. The reality is we may meet somebody this afternoon and the first suggestion of anything could be their line.
And this is my point, though, right? So the point I made earlier on about, I understand why organizations are leaning towards banning banter, right? Is because in one breath, they're trying to create this safe, inclusive culture. Banter brings that into challenge, right? In the next breath, how do we manage banter, right? It's a really kind of grey topic, this grey line you talk about, who knows, right? That's really difficult. And then when you've got a team of, say, 5 people who've worked together for 5 years, and suddenly we're now focused on bringing more diversity into our organization, we bring a person into our team with a different characteristic or some kind of difference, that dynamic changes the team. And then who's at fault? The diverse characteristic for ruining the fact that we can't have our banter anymore, and it's because this new person's coming, or the organization for not navigating that's likely to happen. Like, it's a minefield, right? How do you navigate that stuff?
It is a minefield, but we're kind of talking about two different things, because the reality is, if we've got that new starter who doesn't share the interests or the chemistry with the rest of the team, we've got a responsibility to help them with that. Now, some people don't want to be part of the team and function perfectly acceptably, but we've got to establish what they need too. There also is a responsibility of our colleagues to be able to go, that's enough, Bob, or really, and to be able to spot as the bystanders when people are crossing the line. But equally, we've got a responsibility ourselves to challenge people, and simple words like enough, to make it clear for people.
You also said, and I'm going to come back to you on this now, because you also talked about this line being crossed, right? So we've got to try and navigate this line. And then when it crosses, I know you talk about this quite a lot, but you talk about the buckets that you fall into, right? So let's help our listeners understand what the consequences if we go past that line, or we go too far beyond it. What are these buckets we fall into?
So when I talk about unlawful behaviour, I'm talking about anything that contravenes a law in our country we operate. So if we think about whether that be Equality Acts or People Acts around the world, so therefore anything we do that would be offensive to any of those things would be unlawful. And the most common three buckets that we fall into is we start moving into harassment as we move from what we think is bantering into actually harassing people. The second bucket could be that we turn that into bullying. And then we, by the very nature, have fallen into the discrimination bucket because we're unlawful in the words we're using or what that might suggest.
Yeah, and I did pull this up ready for this episode, right? So what is the definition of these kind of things, right? So bullying is obviously offensive, intimidating, malicious, or insulting behavior, which often through the abuse or misuse of power makes the recipient feel vulnerable, upset, humiliated, or threatened. Again, I don't think that's easy for employers to navigate. I mean, you would hope they'd have bullying and harassment policies anyway, but then harassment occurs when a person is subjected to unwanted conduct that has the purpose or effect of violating a person's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment. What we haven't talked about there is sexual harassment, because that too can fall into the banter line,
Absolutely.
right? So that's also a bit of an issue here. I guess that I keep coming back to this point that I might not agree with it, but I can see why organizations are saying, do you know what, it's easier just to outlaw it, right? Just ban it completely, right? Rather than try and manage this stuff. But I think we're both on the same page where we say that's a mistake and we don't think organizations should do that. Is that fair?
It's not only a mistake, it's a financial mistake for an organization. Banter is demonstrably able to add 35% to people's productivity. Because if we're in an environment we enjoy and we're happy and we're engaged, we're far more productive. A sanitized environment destroys that. However, I appreciate there has to be some guidelines within that as to what crosses the line. And I think we've all been on the receiving end at times of banter that has crossed the line. I know I certainly have.
Yeah. I think so. But I think that's more about educating people on how to navigate that, right? So, because I think if you look at banter from a different lens, right? So we've looked at it purely from this kind of, should it be banned? Is it there? But actually, if you look at banter through just a slightly different view here, it can actually be a term of endearment, right? So if somebody's bantering with you, it means they've accepted you, right? They're confident and comfortable around you, and they've accepted you into their little community or their microculture that exists within an organization. And we often don't look at banter through that lens, but actually it can actually be a point at which somebody says, oh, I've been here 3 weeks and they're bantering with me. I now feel like I'm being accepted. I'm part of this group. And as long as we're seeing banter from a positive light, then that's a really lovely thing to happen, right?
And so long as that banter doesn't intimidate us.
Yeah.
So, I worked with a colleague that we used his nickname of Specs regularly. And it was only actually after about 2 years, he said, I hate being called Specs.
I had a very similar incident with a colleague of mine for years. And I called her Bruiser, right? And it wasn't what you might think. It was about, she had a bruise one day, right? And I nicknamed her Bruiser as a result of this bruise. But actually, I didn't, it was only a year or so later. And she said to me, I absolutely detest that name and I hate it. And I was like, wow. Do you know what I mean? Like I didn't know and I did it. And, there was no malice in the conversation. But I totally get that. And this is the bit, I guess, that people find difficult to navigate because for a year, I could have said, well, you've been fine with it for a year and now all of a sudden you're not happy with it. But it isn't about you've been fine with it for a year. Maybe they just weren't confident enough to say, shut up, Craig, and I don't like it a year ago, right? And now they are. And I think that's the bit that we've got to help managers and individuals in our organizations understand that speak up, and you're entitled to speak up, and you should tell people to shut up if it's gone too far, and B, how to spot it when you think it might have gone too far. What's the kind of signs that demonstrate some of that, right? Because it is difficult to navigate. But I guess there are also some bigger consequences, and this is the bit that I think employers struggle with, and business leaders kind of could probably go back and forth on when it comes to banter, in the sense of it's good camaraderie, good team morale. It provides a really nice, endearing, safe space for people if it's done well. But there are other consequences to it, right? So I pulled some stats because I thought it would be interesting to help people see what some of the consequences are of the banter in the workplace. So ACAS, based in the UK, estimates that the cost of workplace bullying on the economy, right? So the cost to the economy is 18 billion pounds. 18 billion quid.
It's a scary figure, isn't it?
Huge.
But I think it's understandable. You know, if you have been on the receiving end of, we're not talking about being on the receiving end of banter. We're talking about being on the receiving end of banter that is having a negative effect on people. And, you know, that requires the odd day off because you just can't face it. That requires...
Well, that's the next stat, right? That day off, because you just need a break from the banter, or you need that, right? So the number of working days lost to bullying, Andrea Adams Trust estimates to be around 18 million working days per year.
Yeah.
Huge.
Yeah.
Huge. And you think of the cost of that to an organization, right? So work out whatever your cost is for an organization in terms of your sickness absence rate. So if your sickness absence rate is, I don't know, 10% right now, and you could reduce that by 5%, work out the cost saving you'd get for that, and then spend $100,000 of that cost saving on education to help people with this banter stuff. My God, that's an impact, right? That's something you can measure. That's a policy we would get behind from an inclusion perspective. That is hugely powerful and means you get to keep banter and save yourself a few bucks along the way, right? And save people's mental health and absence.
Yeah.
Huge.
And something our sponsors of today's podcast would be delighted
that we're
measuring
talking about.
that impact.
There you go. See, we're getting the sponsors in. Another one that I thought was interesting as well, 75% of employees are affected by workplace bullying as a target or as a witness, according to the University of Phoenix. Witnesses are really interesting, aren't they? Because, and this is particularly prevalent in UK law, in the sense of it doesn't have to be the individual.
Yeah.
It can be a bystander that's offended by what's gone on or feels discriminated by what's gone on. So if that banter crosses the line, the individual recipient of it isn't the only person that could make a claim and say, that went too far. It could be a bystander or somebody else in the vicinity. And that's a big difference.
It is. And we have to remember all of these things are not just conversations. These can be on our Teams chat. These can be in all sorts of different formats. They can be in jokes that clearly are not appropriate for the workplace as well.
Yeah. And then my final one, I've got a couple more, but I'll only share one more with you. But my final one here was men are twice as likely as women to quit their jobs because of bullying.
Yeah.
And that was a study by the University of Copenhagen. I thought that was fascinating because I wouldn't have said that. If you'd have said to me, is that a woke or joke or true or false? I would have said no. But men twice as likely to leave as a result of bullying. How fascinating is that?
And I think it is a fascinating stat, but if you think about the psychology behind that, there is an expectation, whether we like this or not, that people will suck up behaviour in some instances. And I would imagine those individuals have felt they've got no option but to walk with their feet.
Yeah. And it is interesting. I mean, we won't share it on this podcast. Maybe people have to read our book for this one. But we do talk about a story that you and I had to deal with where the consequences of banter going too far would just, in this instance, were catastrophic and were, awful for one particular family. But there are some real dangers when banter goes too far and can be really, really toxic and can be really problematic for individuals as well as organizations as well, right? And we shouldn't shy away from that conversation either. It is an important one, but we won't go into today. But there are some big consequences around that.
Massive
topic.
Consequence.
Yeah. Do you think there's a generational element to this debate and this conversation around banter, right? And the reason I'm saying this is, and I made a joke of this to you, I think, in our last episode, where I said we were going to talk about banter and I was going to send you for the tartan paint, right? So I remember when I first started out in my career, I was working in the hospitality sector, and I think I must have been sent for everything from a left-handed screwdriver to a bucket of tartan paint, endless. Like, I think the worst one that happened to me was I got sent for a long wait. And I literally stood outside, and I literally stood there for nearly 45 minutes waiting for somebody to give me this wait. And then eventually they said, please go back to work. And I was like utterly mortified that I'd fallen for that, like hook, line and sinker. But I was new, I was naive, whatever, right? But it's, do you think there's a generational thing in banter?
I think yes is the simple answer. I think there is, in that, certainly in the earlier part of my career, I was the subject of lots of banter, and some that definitely crossed the line. I think, education's changed in recent years, and I think certainly the under 30s have a different view of banter.
I'm going to say it right, but the line we hear all the time is they're all just a bunch of snowflakes. Right, it is true, isn't it? Like, we have an honest conversation.
Let's see how many people we can offend in one episode.
But people do say, don't they? Oh, everyone's just a bunch of snowflakes these days. You can't have any fun anymore. And
but I think it's been replaced with perhaps even more viciousness. That's perhaps just my experience. But
But I think there is some difference in the generations. I think certainly the older generation are more tolerant to different types of banter, whereas the younger generation, maybe it's through lack of experience, I don't know, or maybe an expectational difference that they have on the workplace and the environment, I don't know. But I definitely think there's something in that generational difference around banter.
Or is there? Because today, literally before we came on air, I've just read an article about a case that's been won by a mature gentleman who has a bald head, who has won a case for being affectionately referred to as Baldy.
Oh, God. All right, I take it all back. What do I know, right? Okay.
And it's a sexual harassment case.
But I guess but there is a difference here, I think, in something that's personal versus something that's light-hearted, fun. There is a bit of a difference in that, right? Maybe I'm overthinking it. I don't know, but I do think, like, if I send you for a long wait, as frustrating as it may be, it's very different from me saying, "Hey, Baldy," or whatever. Right? There is a difference between the two, but I guess it's about tolerance, isn't it? And what's acceptable. So it goes back to your point earlier about what's the line, because for that individual, calling him Baldy is his line, and it went too far. And if people persisted on doing that, then no wonder he's won a claim, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We might laugh at the claim, but actually that was his line and it was crossed. Whereas for me, if somebody called me Baldy, it wouldn't bat an eyelid, but for others, the line's different. And I guess that's the point, isn't it, about banter? It is very different for every individual, and therefore navigating it is hugely challenging for leaders and organizations.
It is. So what are we going to do?
Well, exactly. What should they do about it? What should leaders be thinking tomorrow? Right, let's go to work and ban banter because Dawn and Craig can frighten the life out of me.
I think, in my view, we come back to that wonderful thing of common sense.
Yeah, which isn't always so common.
And we put in place the basics. If we're responsible for a team, we embed good practice around being respectful of everybody, being respectful of difference. And we also are the gatekeeper in terms of making sure people aren't crossing the line. We know who the regular offenders are. Every one of us as managers and leaders know who has a tendency to go too far. So we just need to bring those back in.
Yeah. But we need to, for me, that's education again, right?
Yeah.
So, and I'm sorry if I bang on about this in every bloody episode, but I'm going to continue to bang on about it. We don't train our leaders well enough to do these things, right? 2024 is a very different era from 1984 or 1994 or even 2004, right? So we have to help our leaders understand how to do that, right?
Yes.
We need to help them understand that on the other side of that imaginary line, and the line that's different for everybody, there are 3 buckets, and these are the consequences when it goes too far. And your job as a manager is to navigate when something might go further than the line and how to bring it back.
Yeah.
And when, the how-to bit of that is so important. We just underestimate. Leaders have so much responsibility. We've got to help them. We've got to give them some tools for this stuff.
And I think leaders is one layer of this. Being a good colleague is another.
Well, yeah.
And, to be mindful of being comfortable to step in and go, all right.
Pack it in now. That's gone a bit far.
Yeah. Because we've spotted it. But we've also got a personal responsibility too.
To speak up and say something.
Yeah. And like I say, it doesn't need to be a big, long dialogue. Enough can be the safe word.
Yeah. And I guess the other bit for me is all of this feeds into culture, right? So as a bigger topic, culture is a big, something as leaders we've got to be mindful of. What is the impact on our culture? And we've got a governance responsibility as exec directors of our organizations to ensure that our culture is one that is positive and all of that kind of good stuff. And so, what are we actually doing? What responsibility are we taking for some of this stuff? And the risks that are associated with this going wrong are far outweigh the cost of any kind of training for our leadership teams, right? So we've got to get that right for a start and make sure that we're taking some responsibility for that, right?
We've got to take responsibility. We've got to educate, but we've also got to toe the line too. And, our teams will...
Role model it. Yeah.
Our teams will copy us and we will set the line in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
So again, we can practically bring it back too.
I think one of my favorite lines for leaders to use in this topic is to reassure the people in our teams that, it's not okay if you're not okay.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right. And therefore tell me you're not okay and I'll make it stop.
Yeah.
Right. I'll pull it back because it's not okay if you're not okay. So I think we've got to get leaders that confidence to be able to say, it's not okay if you're not okay. So it's fine we have a bit of banter, but if you're not okay, you tell me and I'll pull it back.
Exactly that.
Give them that confidence to say, do you know what, Craig? I'm a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Okay. That's all I need to know and I'll bring it back for you. And then if we give leaders and individuals those kind of tools and techniques, they'll self-manage this stuff, won't they? We won't need to do much more.
No.
Because they'll self-manage it.
Exactly.
Just got to give them a bit of confidence. Okay, good. Well, hopefully our leaders, our listeners have got a bit of information on banter, and we haven't scared them to the point where they're going to go away and ban banter themselves, but instead just perhaps manage it a little bit better.
Love that.
So we're at the point in the show where we hand over the mic. And last episode I asked listeners to send us their questions to Evan. So again, just to remind you, we don't have sight of these questions, but the fabulous Evan has been collating them and will bring us the sealed envelope in a second.
Fantastic.
To say, here's your questions, Craig and Dawn, and we're going to get those answers, but we don't get to
Evan,
see them.
I'm having the envelope because it's definitely my turn to ask them. Thank you.
Don't ever do that
again. Right, let's see what we have got. So the first question is, do you think banter plays a role in shaping a positive, inclusive culture? I think we've covered that. And if so, to what extent?
So I would just add to that, yes, it does, but we've got to be mindful that a culture isn't just one culture. It's usually a collection of mini cultures. And so same principle applies. the culture in one team will be very different from a culture in another team. And when we then think about mobility in an organization, so individuals moving from one team to the next, we've got to be mindful of them moving from one culture to another within our organization. And yes, we want a kind of centralized rules-based, boundaries, but actually the cultures will be different, and therefore the banter lines will be different. And we've got to help people navigate that as they become mobile in our organizations.
Love that. Is there ever a situation where it's okay to joke about protected characteristics?
Oh, yeah, I think there is actually, and I say that with love and affection, right? Because, you've got protected characteristics. My son has got a protected characteristic. I've got a protected characteristic. If I got upset every time one of my friends called me some name about being gay, right, I'd be a very rich man. But I'm not offended by that stuff. So my line is very different. And so, it doesn't bother me in the slightest. But my son gets offended on my behalf, right?
Yes.
Which is really interesting. So if one of my friends says something to me in a joking way, Jacob would say, "Don't you offend my dad," right? And he'll get quite protective of me, and that's really, really sweet. And I say to him, "No, it's okay, I'm not bothered." And he's like, "Well, I am." And I love that for him. At 11 years of age, he's strong enough to be and independent enough to kind of challenge on my behalf. I mean, love that. But we do have those kind of differences. So yes, I think it's okay if the people you're having the conversation with are comfortable with that, then why not, right? But it's about environment again, isn't it? And it's about understanding the line. So it's less about the protected characteristic for me, and it's more about individual lines and preferences.
Love that. So this is a great question. Has your banter ever accidentally offended someone in the workplace? And if so, how did you handle it?
Yeah, lots of times. I've definitely made lots of mistakes, and I've overstepped the line myself. If I'm being honest, sometimes it hasn't ended well, and we've had to have disagreements, or I've made mistakes, right? And I think we all do. I think nobody's perfect, which is why I encourage people not to over police this stuff, because I've been guilty of stepping over the line myself. But in the main, I'm able to say, "Look, I'm really sorry. I genuinely don't want to offend anybody, and I may have made a mistake, and I am genuinely sincere in my apologies. I'm a joker. I like to have a bit of fun at work. I spend a lot of time at work, and therefore I want an environment that I can have some fun in." But equally, my fun doesn't mean somebody else should be miserable. And if somebody makes me aware of that, I will immediately step back and say, "I'm sorry," because I don't want to offend anybody. So I think it comes back to your point about personal responsibility. You've got to take some responsibility here and be able to say, "Oh, my bad. I shouldn't have done that."
Yeah. Great. And the final question, should we have written policies in place regarding banter?
So I don't think you need to, would be my take on it. And I wouldn't encourage my clients to write a banter policy, for sure. I think you've got other protections in your organization. So you've got things like your code of conduct. You've got things like your company values or your behavior charters and all of these kind of things. They're the things that kind of protect you or give you the opportunity to manage these kind of behaviors anyway. So by creating another policy, you're just over policing it again, or you're creating an environment where you're almost making it really hard for yourself to achieve it, right? And let's take that a step further. If you get taken to an employment tribunal for banter and you've got a policy on banter, that's what they're going to use to measure you, right? So don't make it really impossible for yourself to live up to your own expectations. If you can't, you know your business better than me, but I just think a banter policy makes it really hard to live up to that, when actually you've got other things that can help you. You've got laws that exist within the environment you work. So every country will have laws around discrimination, harassment, behavior, these kind of things. They protect the individual. You've got company values and mission statements and behavioral codes. They would protect individuals. And these are the things as an organization you can lean on. But the best thing you can do is just educate people to understand that sometimes we cross the line, and it's our responsibility to say, "I'm sorry, and I'm going to step back over the line, or for our colleagues to say, hey, Craig, you've overstepped there and you need to step back, mate. Let's do a bit more of that and less of the policy writing. That's my opinion. Would you disagree with that?
No, not at all. I am very much a practical application person.
Good. Good. Don't like disagreements. Okay, well, hopefully we've answered the questions for our listeners. Next time on You Must Be Woking, we are going to be talking about bias. So please do get your questions in. Remember, you can email them to evan@metimer.global. He will collate them. He won't show them to us, I promise, until he hands us the envelope on our next episode. But next time we're going to be talking about bias. So if you've got any questions on bias, send them in. And hopefully, no, I won't go into. I was going to say, make a flippant comment about how much money you've spent on bias training. Although, if you want to send us a note and tell us how much money you've spent on that, I'd be fascinated to know. Ranting. Anyway, hopefully we've answered your questions this time. So, Dawn, before we wrap up this episode of You Must Be Woking, we are on to our recurring feature of Woke or Joke.
Wow.
And it's my turn.
Oh.
I get to ask you, is this woke or joke? So, is it true that a woman made a claim against her workplace because they denied her request to bring in her pet snake as an emotional support animal? Woke or joke?
So, I would love to say that's a joke, but I suspect it's not.
It's a joke.
It is a
I'm
joke.
laughing, right? Because I'm so glad that it was a joke.
Yay! Boo.
So for those of you that may be joining us for the first time, our Woke and Joke feature is a bit of a competition between Dawn and I to spot the news stories or the articles that are jokes or are actual woke stories in the press or wherever they've come from. And whoever has the least amount of points at the end of this season will have to buy the other person dinner. So we're trying to think of some fabulous places to take one another. So feel free to drop some recommendations on our socials. You'll find us at Metimer Global or at Metimer Global. And tell us more what you think.
Absolutely.
And that's it, Dawn. We're at the end of another episode. I went quick today, didn't it? It's a nice short one.
Good.
Bit of bants, get the bants out.
Absolutely.
All right, well, that's it from us. Thank you for joining us for You Must Be Woking. It's bye from me.
And bye from me.
You Must Be Woking is brought to you by Metimer Global, where measuring inclusion matters. Visit www.metimer.global or check out our socials, Metimer Global.